Welcome back to the Rational Educator Podcast. It's our first episode of the year, and we're getting back to fundamentals: reading, writing, arithmetic, and also literature, history, and science, the so-called academic subjects. It's pretty clear that modern education has been waging a war on these subjects, subverting them with politics and propaganda, or just ignoring them altogether. But this war has been going on for over 100 years, and in this episode of The Rational Educator, we're going to find out why. If you like what we're doing here at The Rational Educator, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss an episode. And check out our website, rationaleducator.com, for education resources. Here's the episode. All right, welcome to another episode of the Rational Educator Podcast. And in this week's episode, we want to talk about academic subjects, or more precisely, why academic subjects are no longer the focus of modern education. And to do that, let's first talk about what we mean by academic subjects. And I'm going to toss this to our expert, one of our experts, Dr. Andrew Bernstein. Andy, what do you have to say about academic subjects?
They're good, but to flesh that out a little bit, first of all, the academic subjects are the ones that train the mind in teaching, in thinking method. So reading, writing, and mathematics. Those are thinking skills, and we want to train people to, students growing up. We want them, they're rational beings, they're human beings, they have a rational mind. We want, and the rational mind needs to be trained. Just like, a bird, a mother bird will teach her fledglings how to fly, the fledglings' wings need to be developed. Well, so does a young human being's mind. And the thinking skills start with the classic 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic. That's the first thing to say about, I think, academic subjects, that they train the mind in thinking. And the second thing is the content of an academic education would be in literature, history, science, and mathematics. I think those are the 4 basic academic subjects. Let me repeat: history, literature, mathematics, and science. And I think these are the subjects that children should learn growing up, even before school. Mom and dad could start, at home, and going through school. And as they develop, we could add on other things, perhaps, in the high schools, or else leave these other practical skills and vocational training to after school activities and vocational schools and such. But that's the core of a good education is the subjects that teach human beings, thinking skills. That's reading, writing, and math. And then the academic content is mathematics, science, literature, and history. That, I think, is the essence of a very good education.
Well, now in my generation, it was sort of a given that these would be the priorities. These subjects would be given the highest priority in teaching, and we know that, and we'll get to why the modern curriculum, particularly in the public schools, and driven by what we see in the teachers' colleges, we know that they've been not only de-emphasized but attacked in modern education. But this war against these subjects goes back a lot further than our modern era. So what can you say about the origins of this war?
Yeah, you're right. This goes back 100 years at least, Joel. And we can keep picking on, my favorite villain in American education. That, of course, is John Dewey, who was a philosophy professor at University of Chicago and then at Columbia University for many years. And his William Hurt Kilpatrick, who considered himself Dewey's chief disciple, who was head of, what was it, Deanna? I think the philosophy of education department at Teachers College.
Yeah, in Columbia, yeah.
Yeah, and this was at Columbia's Teachers College, 1920s, 1930s. This was the main place for training teachers across the country, and still, a prominent teachers college. And they had the idea You know what? There were the so-called progressive educators, and the progressives, and 100 years ago, and their contemporary heirs. They often differ on what they think should be taught, but where they all agree is what should not be taught. They want to de-emphasize the academic program. They want to they're opposed to systematic phonics as the means of teaching reading, in favor of some version of the whole word method, which just flat out doesn't work, which means the kids are going to struggle simply with the mechanics of reading. They're against the academic program, and usually in favor of, Kilpatrick favored the project method. You work together in groups on various practical projects, so you learn, one, practical things, and two, how to work with a group, and if necessary, to conform. If you, as a member of a group, if your independent judgment tells you what the group wants to do is wrong, well, you try to reason with them. But if they don't agree, you conform, you comply, you comply with the group, and that's how we can work together collectively. So vocational training, practical skills. Notice the schools today teach driver's ed, sex ed, hygiene, practical skills, which are valuable, by the way. But I don't think school time should be devoted to that. I think parents should teach that at home. Practical skills like that, learning to work in a group, learning to conform to the group, learning to live, in a collective society. And the ultimate political goal, ultimately politics plays a major role here, and that is, notice that Dewey and Kilpatrick, and some of the other professors at Teachers College, Columbia, pilgrimage to the Soviet Union, and came back with glowing reports about education under Joseph Stalin, by the way, and that's a major clue. And does anybody doubt that the overwhelming number of education professors in the United States are hardcore leftists? They want to destroy capitalism. They want to instill socialism, if not outright communism, to a collectivist dictatorship where your life belongs to the state. And you conform to the group and you comply to the state. And I think the ultimate vision here, Joel and Deanna and everybody, goes all the way back to Plato, of the philosopher king, that will have an educated intellectual elite. We'll educate the few, the brightest. Early 20th century, that's when Stanford Binet IQ test was developed, and the education schools, we'll IQ test the kids. And we'll take the few who are the best and the brightest, and we'll give them the full academic program. We'll push them on the college track. They're the ones who are society's future leaders, the politicians and the bankers and the successful businessmen and the teachers and the writers and the journalists in our day, the filmmakers, and so on. And the rest of us schlubs, we don't need that much academic training. We'll get a minimum of academic training, and and a lot of vocational training and practical skills. And so the ultimate goal then is, for most of us, we will be good at our jobs and we'll obey the wise rulers of the state. And it's very Platonic, philosopher king, top down kind of society where we all live for the state takes care of us, and everything will be nobody will disagree. We'll obey the wise rulers of the state, and we'll have a very happy, socially engineered society. I think that's the ultimate vision.
Yeah, there's a lot of great ideas. Let's unpack some of them. You mentioned a term earlier about the practicality of the move away from these basic foundational subjects, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And that really begs the question, what does it mean to be practical? And the vision espoused by these progressive thinkers was that these subjects were reserved for an elite class, and all the rest of us, what the rest of us need is that vocational training that you speak of, which they see as divorced from all these other ideas. So
let me say one more thing, because I know Dr. D will have a lot to say on this. But what's forgotten today is early 20th century, a lot of people embraced eugenics. And this idea of socially engineering, we can engineer society so that the term feeble-minded was popular back then. Imagine using that today. But so the feeble-minded could be sterilized or whatever, or discouraged from reproducing, and the more intelligent people would reproduce, and society would be, greatly improved. Now, in a free society, there's no hope of forcibly sterilizing people, whatever their IQ levels are, whatever IQ even measures. There's no hope of forcibly sterilizing anybody, nor should there be. And the next best, or even encouraging or discouraging people who wanted to have children, from having children because they were deemed feeble-minded or not as intelligent as their peers. And so the next best thing for the progressive educators was this tracking system in the schools, where we IQ test the kids, and we push the elite, the intellectual elite, onto the college program, and the feeble-minded, they can't use that term anymore. So the less intelligent, those of more modest intelligence, would get vocational training, and in the cities they'd become industrial workers, in the factories, in the rural areas they'd become farmers and farm workers. And so, from the progressive educator's point of view, what this did was it established a productive place in society for those of lesser intelligence. And the underlying, more insidious subtext is, and your place. You're subordinate. You're a worker ant here. You're not one of you're not the queen bee in the colony. You take orders from the intellectual elite who will govern in the classroom and in the legislature. And so the eugenics is way out of fashion today, as it should be. But it has a major role in the genesis of educational policies in this country, go back 100 years.
Definitely. One of the sort of proponents of that philosophy of eugenics, if you'll allow that term being called a philosophy or a way of thinking, was Herbert Spencer. And he wrote quite a bit about education in the mid 19th century. And so he also, and this is earlier than Dewey and his ilk, would put forth this idea of the Platonic philosopher kings. But, we always have to remember that the American system is built on the Prussian system. It's in the mid 19th century where these, people from Michigan and ultimately in Massachusetts who went over and they observed this and they brought this system back. And this was a system that was to train soldiers to not think for themselves. And so if you kind of look at the underlying premise of the American system that we borrowed from Prussia, it's not about training individuals to be thinkers. Now, you did want to have, I think they did want to have a literate society, but they threw around this term of civic-minded individual. So they wanted to have this sort of educated citizenry, but they wanted them educated in their way. And so that's why this Prussian system allowed for that to happen. Now you fast forward 50 years and you get into the Dewey era. They have a sort of a different idea of what an educated citizenry would be. It's not someone who is going to be able to think for themselves and go out and make an educated vote or something like that. They believe that you have to have these, like what Dr. Andy was saying, these practical skills. And we even still have that today. It's just repackaged into this sexy new term called project-based learning. And that is everywhere in education. I mean, that is really being pumped out in teachers' colleges. It's being really pushed even in higher education, where everybody you want to break your students out into groups and do these projects, and you're just really getting any sort of individual achievement. That is no longer like a good thing or an acceptable thing in educational theory. And that goes back to Dewey and, the sort of progressive movement, and it's really come to a head today. But our whole system is so brilliantly designed based on this Prussian system to make all of this happen, to where we can get away from these academic subjects, reading, writing, arithmetic, the 3 R's, where that teaches kids and even adults how to think and how to think for themselves. And if you push away those subjects and you do more project-based learning or group learning or practical skill learning, then you're going to teach individuals to think as groups and collectively, and to not want to excel as on their own or come up with their own ideas. I mean, you even see this in the workforce where it's all about collaboration, and it's not about individuals coming up with ideas. You're working in teams and groups. And so it's really prominent throughout the culture. And you're like, where did this come from? Well, we've been doing it for 100 years. And after, so many generations, it just is intrinsic into this is how we do things. We don't worry about the individual anymore. Individual achievement is actually bad, is what's being taught. And that comes from this move away from academic subjects. Now, I'm not saying that kids don't learn how to add 1 + 1. Well, maybe in the modern world they don't, because we now have social justice math. And so, they're learning that math is racist. 1 + 1 = 2 is a racist idea, which is incredible. But this whole system is just primed for this attack on wanting to learn, to these academic subjects, wanting to learn and come to conclusions on your own, wanting to do your own research and gather information, and putting forth your own ideas and your own assessment and bouncing those ideas off of other individuals. I mean, that's how you really learn, is engage in, debate and these thought experiments of, I thought it meant this. And you can even do that with literature. But then you have the teacher in the front of the classroom, typically, who is there to moderate, to interject ideas, to say that's an interesting idea. However, we need to take it in the context in which it was written, not in the context of our 21st century lens, and all of these other things. But all of that is just going to the wayside, where you just break everybody into groups, and then you just have them think, and you tell them what to think. And then you have them just kind of assess. And it's really sad to see, because it's on every level in education, and even is transmitted into industries. And you would think, these sort of industries where you would need innovation and these sort of individual ideas. And so that's where we are. I mean, that's how I see where we are now and where it comes from, and how it was just easy. I mean, you look back as a historian and you're like, oh, well, of course that happened. If you look at all these things just lined up, priming little by little, you can just see how it unravels.
And one last point here. They say, Deanna and Joel and everybody, that the proof is in the pudding. Nice phrase. And you look at the academic test scores, the international test scores, and you see American kids, year after year on the PISA test, right? They're every 2 years, as I recall, the international tests. Year after year, you see the American kids scoring relatively low compared to kids from countries around the world. And the reason for that is not hard. Yeah, after this discussion, the reason for that is easy to identify. Any number of Asian and European nations, the school systems that teach academic subjects much more widely and deeply than the American school system does. That's why the Asian and European kids over and over again score better on international academic tests than the American kids do. It's not hard. This ain't rocket surgery, as they say. It's not hard to figure out what the cause is. So the proof is in the pudding. Well, the American pudding is rancid, and we just identify why.
And an answer to the testing issue is that tests are racist. They're white supremacist. And so we're no longer going to be testing anymore. We're no longer going to be giving marks, grades. Grades are racist. And this is all coming forth. And we're seeing this more and more in educational conferences, what's being pushed out in educational, like in districts and stuff. They're just doing away with grades, saying that, it's racist to try to do anything on merit anymore. And that's great, right? So then you don't have to worry about international tests, because we're not going to participate anymore. So you don't have to look at those scores.
You know what? It's not funny. You know what I'm thinking, Deanna? How many Asian parents in the United States want to stop testing, their kids? I'm guessing there's not very many. The Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Indian parents where the culture really emphasizes education, and the parents usually involved in the kids' education. I'm guessing they want to see the testing to see how their kids are doing, especially when their kids tend to excel on those tests, and helps get them into Princeton, Harvard, Stanford, universities like that. Not just the Asian parents, but a lot of Black and white parents too, who want their kids, to do well, and then Latino parents want their kids to do well. They want the testing. They want to see how well the kids are doing, and they don't. The overwhelming majority of American parents of any race, I think, don't think that mathematics is racist. That 2 + 2 = 4 is racist. That's leftists think that, most of whom happen to be white, for whatever that's worth. And very, very few other people, I think, in this country.
Well, the modern education theorists actually have an answer for that. And they would say that the students who succeed in the testing processes have an advantage over the less fortunate, which puts them into the higher end of the power dynamics. And because every modern education theorist looks at the world with a Marxist lens, anyone
not to mention postmodernist
yes,
take on Marxism,
and they see this as an issue of power dynamics, so that anyone who is at the high end needs to be inverted to give the less fortunate at the lower end a chance to succeed. So that's what the Marxists would say.
Yeah. Well, who cares what they say, right? You put their ideas into practice, and you murder 150 million innocent civilians in relentless, class warfare. But let's leave it a little more rational here. Yeah, we want to help the kids who are struggling. The kids who are doing well, overwhelmingly, I think, have parents who, one, value reading effectively and value education, and two, are involved in their kids' education. And so the thing to do is not to stop testing or try to hamper the kids at the top or bring them down or anything like that. Obviously, the thing to do is try to promote education amongst the parents of the kids who aren't doing so well. It doesn't matter what race or gender the kids are. If the parents value education and encourage education, teach the kids to read at an early age using systematic phonics. If the parents do that and are actively participate in their child's education, you're going to see the overwhelming preponderance of those children do well. Either gender, any race, tribe, nationality, it doesn't matter. We need the parents involved in the education. That's where the push.
Well, that would require an admission that the development of the human mind should be at the forefront of education, right, which is in direct opposition to the schools of thought today.
Yeah, no, and that's absolutely right. That's where, as a devout atheist, I say, thank God for Ayn Rand. Because Atlas Shrugged shows us, you couldn't show it any more clearly, dramatized in the action of the story, the role of the mind in human life, and why the mind must be valued, why the mind must be developed, why educating the mind must be the purpose of schooling, and so on and so forth. I think with Atlas Shrugged out there, there's 60-something years in the culture, having made a little bit of headway in the culture, there's at least some hope for us to reach the parents and change the education system. If Ayn Rand had written Atlas Shrugged, I don't know. I'm not sure there'd be any hope, at this point.
Well, I do think that that we can look to history and see examples of the results of developed minds achieving great things, but it does require another great mind to create stories that illustrate that in great drama, as in the case of Atlas Shrugged.
Indeed. And by the way, you're probably familiar, and we could reach out to our audience. Andrew Coulson's book, Market Education, was is very good. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago at a young age. But one of the things he does in Market Education is Coulson goes through the whole history, showing the difference between countries where schooling is controlled by parents, as distinct from schooling controlled by the government. And the great contrast to me, and I mentioned it in my book, I use it as an example in my book, on education, why Johnny still can't read or write or understand math, is the contrast between Athens and Sparta. You were talking about, the Prussian system before. Well, the Prussian system was very Spartan, militaristic.
Definitely. Yeah.
Militaristic. The Spartan system. The kids were dragged away from their mothers. The young little boys are dragged away from their mothers at age 7 to be raised by the state, to be trained to be warriors, to fight and die for the state. And the Spartan was like, schooling was completely controlled by the state, and the Spartans were largely illiterate. Whereas in Athens, the schooling was controlled by parents. And of course, what you said, Joel, is a great historical example of this brilliant golden age. Great advances in literature and the great philosophers, either were born there or, like Aristotle, moved there. You see all these advances in various arts, and the first democratic society that we know of, in mathematics, and so on and so forth. We see this flourishing of a brilliant intellectual culture in a society where parents control schooling, and there were any number of private schools. Plato had a school, Aristotle's school, any number of other philosophers and educators had school. There was even the one Colson talks about even one well-known school run by a woman, even though the Athenians, as advanced as they were, still held the prejudice, that women were inferior to men. But she ran and she was a foreigner too. I can't remember her name offhand. Aspasia, was that her name? Right, foreign.
Yeah, Aspasia. She was, she was a woman, but in some circle, some history books, they say that she was a companion, a woman companion, but there were educated women in Athens in the time, but they weren't the typical wives of the elite. They were usually single, and they would be the ones that would go to the symposia and with the men and have conversations, and would accompany them in some cases. So I'll just leave it at that without getting too graphic.
No, okay. But according to Colson, her school was commercially successful. So even though there's this prejudice even in Athens against women, parents wanted their kids to be educated. Parents want their kids to learn academic subjects. And she evidently was a very good teacher, or her staff were very good teachers, and parents sent their kids to her school, and she did well. It really shows how parents almost always value academic education, for their kids, much more than the government does.
Go back to the classical world. I mean, even in Greece, young girls could be educated at home, and they could be learned. They could learn to read and write. It wasn't against anything. But I mean, I'm talking particularly in Athens. In Sparta, like what Dr. Andy said, the boys were taken away at a young age. And it was really brutal. There was even one exercise when they're still what we would consider today is quite a young kid, where they would have to, in night, go and run across this field and try to get food without being caught or without being noticed. And if they were caught or noticed, in some cases, there's some references where the kids would even be killed, because then they wouldn't have been good warriors if they weren't stealthy enough. And so it's for the state. And I mean, you can even look at, we have public education in America today, but even the basis of that was for the states. We need civic-minded individuals for the state. You can look at modern China. You can say, wow, their test scores are really high, but why is that? Why do they value education? Everything they're doing in China is for the state. So you're very right in saying whenever there's state sort of funded or sponsored or controlled education, it is for the good of the state, not the good of the individual. And what has happened in America in particular, and this has been upsetting to me for quite a while, is that now parents don't really have to parent. They don't have to feed their kids 3 meals a day in a lot of places, because breakfasts in some places, definitely lunch, they don't have to think about their kid for 6 to 7 hours a day. They don't even have to think about where their kid is. Their kid's in school. I don't have to parent. I don't have to think about this. Or if they're doing all these different activities. And so what that does, and this isn't all parents by any means, but what it does is that it takes the role of the parent away from the parent. And it's been ironically, I'll use the word progressively. It's been progressively getting worse over time. What I see is worse, where the state is taking more and more of the sort of role of the parent we've talked about it before, where it's really coming to a head now. And there are some politicians saying that the parents shouldn't have a role in rearing their own children. And that's really frightening. I mean, that sounds communism. That sounds Sparta. I mean, that is really, as a historian, that's a red flag for me.
No, absolutely. You're right, Deanna. And Terry McAuliffe said as much, right? Parents shouldn't be telling the schools what to teach their children. I have a question.
That's the former gubernatorial candidate in the 2020 election, Terry McAuliffe.
Yeah, and a former governor. He was a former governor of Virginia, and then he was running again, this past year. But I have a question. Go back to China. So, where there's a tremendous amount of brain power, in the Chinese people, but the government is a communist totalitarian state. So I'm wondering, in the schools, including up through the colleges, I'm sure they're teaching, math and science effectively. So, because they want, it's for the good of the state. You want to build weapons, and you want to build satellites, you want to control space, and you want to, so on and so forth. And including a lot of technological advances, I'm sure that would develop in the West. But the question I have is, how much Western philosophy are they teaching? Even in the colleges, how much Western literature are they teaching? Are they teaching Ayn Rand, for example? My guess is they're not teaching much of that, because then you're in the humanities, and then you're thinking about moral questions, and then you're thinking about, how should an individual conduct his or her life, and what's the proper relationship between an individual and the state. I don't think a communist regime wants, leading students thinking about those kinds of moral issues. So I'm guessing the superb education is probably limited to math and science.
Yeah, definitely. It would be the STEM fields that they're pushing, but they do have, and that's what's tested, right? Is the STEM fields in these international tests. They also test reading, but in order to, do well in anything, as we've talked about, you have to be able to read. So they can read well, they do math well. And they respond well on these international tests, the way that these testing that is spread across. The PISA tests are all over all over the world, and countries opt in. But if you think about it, they don't have to teach the humanities to do well on those tests and to keep their scores high, right? They don't have to think about these ideas, like what it means to be human, what it means to be an individual, right, what it means to live a good life and be happy. Right. You're right. You're absolutely right. Those wouldn't be taught. Yeah,
they could, in literature, they could use systematic phonics and read stories that talk about like socialist realism kind of stuff. Where you conform to the group, you obey the state, you toil for the masses, and so on. You wouldn't have them reading Sophocles' Antigone. You wouldn't have them reading Ibsen's Enemy of the People. You wouldn't have them reading Ayn Rand's The Founder. You don't want them thinking about these kinds of.
Absolutely. If they are reading literature, it's going to be propaganda literature that is put out by the state, and some of it has leaked out. So we know about that. So they're not reading the Great Books program by any means.
Yeah,
in China.
I would think so.
Yeah.
At any communist or fascist. Fascist.
But we're not communists in America, supposedly, and we're not reading it
yet.
So
not yet, but we're moving in that direction.
It seems that way, yeah.
Actually, I shouldn't say moving, we're being pushed in that direction.
Yeah.
But we do,
and it's great, this Prussian system just allows for it. So it's working out great for them, unfortunately. But luckily there are people like us that are going to try to keep speaking out against it.
We still have freedom of speech. As long as we do, we will.
Yeah. Now, when in our discussion about math and reading and writing, I want to make sure that we don't give short shrift to math in this triangle, because as much as reading and writing are themselves valuable tools to apprehend the world of, recorded knowledge, math and then ultimately science give you tools to apprehend the world, the physical world. So
improve it in service of human life.
That's right. And pretty much everyone who goes through math programs asks themselves the question, unless they take to it like a duck to water, they ask themselves the question: how is learning how to calculate the angles of a triangle going to help me in my adult life? How's it going to help me find a job? And to that extent, you can ask the same question about a lot of the other aspects of what we might consider to be a foundational education. How is this going to help me? And I think the message that we're trying to drive here is not that these are subjects that should be taught as an end in itself, but that they're practical, and that they train the mind to apprehend the world and to be able to read the knowledge and understand and grasp the generations that came before, and to be able to use that to further their own lives. So I think that, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think one of the vectors of attack by education theorists on the 3 Rs is that they're not practical. And because they may seem, to those who are struggling with their multiplication tables, right? What is the practical value of this? And that opens the door for a John Dewey to say, well, let's teach you how to work on a factory. Let's teach you practical things that will help you get a job. So let's talk a little bit about the true practicality of the 3 Rs.
Well, yeah, definitely. The practicality of them is that it trains, like even doing mathematics as a little kid, learning addition and then subtraction and then working into multiplication, division, fractions, all of that. What you're doing is training your mind to problem solve and to, instead of just guessing, trying to get an answer, which is what multiple choice tests teach kids. If you actually have them do the work and show their work and work out problems, then what they're learning is problem solving and how to take information, and then how, it's inductive and deductive reasoning. And all of this is taught over time. And back to Dewey in that generation in the early 20th century, they saw this as not practical because it's that, what you said, Joel, is this going to help me get a job? And maybe, a second grader doing multiplication, they're like, if this isn't going to help me get a job, well, maybe learning to train your brain to think is somehow down the road going to help you get a job.
And furthermore, also achieving success, being and failure, but it trains your mind to have a relationship with reality. So you try things, you try to work out a formula, you try to sound out the letters in a word, and you succeed or fail, and you understand what it's like to live in the world. And through success and failure, to a certain extent, you find out how to do it. You learn how to become independent, which therefore makes it quite plain why modern education theorists would be against it.
I'm an inveterate humanities guy. I was never a great math student, but even I could see, the practical value of math. I walk into Walmart. I'm a kid from Brooklyn, so I see this very much, at sea level. I walk into Walmart and I want to buy 4 chairs for my garden, and they're $13.59. A piece, and I check how much money I have in my wallet or how much I have left on my credit card, and I could add it up, and see, and see what it comes to, because I know basic arithmetic. It's a simple example, but there's all kinds of things involved in balancing your checkbook and figuring out, with my paycheck, these are my expenses for this month. This is how much I could save. And having basic math skills, is very conducive towards improving your life.
But Andy, consider the mind of someone who doesn't have those skills and feels either inferior or incapable of using skills like that to live in the world. What might they do? They might clamor to an authority to just give them stuff.
Well, right. Well, thank you for proving my point. There's all the more reason to teach these poor kids, let me drop the poor, to teach these kids basic math. The very small number of human beings, what's the word today? Not supposed to use retarded anymore. Cerebrally challenged? That sounds
developmentally, or what is
developmentally challenged?
Yeah,
Yeah, or developmentally disabled, but the word disabled is not used. Yeah, I
okay,
don't know.
but well, let's just stay with reality and not woke, politically correct terminology. Are physically disabled to the point, physically impaired to the point where they can't learn math, reading, writing. It's just a tiny percentage of the human population. The rest of us can learn all these basic skills and then be equipped, like you said, Joel, to go out into the world and deal much more effectively with, with reality. That's why we need to teach math, to very early age, even to kids like me who didn't like it. Um, a reading, I mean, it should be fairly obvious. You want to have any kind of a life in a society, you need to be able to read the dominant language in that society and understand it for any number of reasons, including a lot of things on the job. And I think we should mention one of my heroes, Robert Maynard Hutchins, from who with Mortimer Adler spearheaded the Great Books program back in 1920s and 1930s. They had the idea that a good education involves mastery of the great classics of the Western canon in literature, philosophy, science, mathematics, right, across the board. Anyway, Hutchins' point, one of the points he made was he was who was he, the president of the University of Chicago for a while, as I recall. His point was that for somebody who's been trained in all these thinking skills that we've been talking about and whose mind thinks proficiently, it's not that difficult for an employer in on-the-job training to train them in the specific skills that they'll need in this job or that, because the kids come out of the schools, crisp thinkers, and they can pick up the skills and the knowledge in on-the-job training in a matter of weeks or months, and then go on for years and even decades of being very, very good employees in the company or going out on their own as entrepreneurs and starting their own companies. I think Hutchins is right. If we train the kids to think effectively, it's not that hard for them to learn vocational skills or, the skills of this particular job via on-the-job training.
I'd also like to add to that in the corporate world now, we know this from some of our friends who are deep in the corporate world, one of their biggest challenges, particularly with the new generation of employees that are coming online, is their interpersonal skills. How do they interact with other employees, and they're not just their peers, but also customers or whoever they're interacting with at other companies, email correspondence, going to conferences. How do they interact with other people? Any student who is well versed in the great stories of the past will have the experience of decades, if not hundreds of years of personal interactions just by reading stories. They'll know that if they try to behave in this way, it could receive a corresponding consequence based on the experience they may have gleaned from the stories, the great classics of the past. So it's not just the power and skill of learning expression, learning how to write. It's also coming to the knowledge of how to interact with other people that they can get from the great classics.
I get your point, Joel, and that makes sense to me. But also, I've taught business ethics for many years, and I know, another complaint in corporate America has been for decades now that the kids come out of college and they don't write well. The businesses are looking for people who could write, and sometimes they're even hiring, from what I understand, somebody who graduated with a degree in English rather than a degree in business or marketing, because the English students may actually have some writing skills.
That's not true in today's world, though. The English students are not great writers.
Yes, you're right. I see it with my students. This is sad but true.
But it's a good point that you make. Now, the thing is, it's what's required is not just skill in composition or grammar or writing in general, but it's also a sense of empathy and understanding of context and your common humanity with other people. which again goes back to understanding the great books, not just literature, but the history of the past.
Yeah,
So
I think I would call it the rules of civility, how to just interact, or manners, or decorum, and how to engage with other humans. And that's a huge component that's missing.
and those rules are not necessarily hard, fast commandments on stone tablets, right?
No.
And they have a very important utility in a civilized world. But how do you learn them? You learn them by interacting with other people and seeing what is good behavior, not just good according to a commandment, but good as in what greases the wheels for civilized behavior. What have we seen in the past that's worked? And again, that is why this is another argument for learning the great books through literature or history.
No, I agree. And there are a lot of people who will tell me, or us in this case, look, there's a lot of kids can't master these kind of academic subjects. It's too hard for them. So let me make some film recommendations here. Now, first of all, Stand and Deliver.
I knew you were going there.
Yeah, my
Great
all-time, my all-time favorite Teacher in the Hood, movie. Well, where in the real life story of Jaime Escalante, a great math teacher who took these kids, these Chicano kids and lower income kids who the public schools thought really couldn't master higher mathematics, taught them higher mathematics, taught them calculus. These kids all passed the AP test and then did it for years and years. True story of what a great teacher could do. And of course, the greatest teacher of all, I think, Marva Collins. Great movie about her also, the Marva Collins story with Cicely Tyson and Morgan Freeman, which I would strongly recommend. Again, she took kids that the public schools thought were uneducable, and she trained them to be, just superb students. And the combination of tough love, tender love, systematic phonics to teach reading, very, very, very high expectations and demanding academic standards. And the kids responded. Marva Collins said the kids will respond to the expectations, that you have for them. And these kids responded very, very well. And I think this is the way education could be and should be. You start in kindergarten, if not before, and you get this great education with teachers like that, in the academic program. You know what? We get to senior year in high school, 12th grade. You know what I would do? I would teach a full year at that point, a full year of the history of Western philosophy using W.T. Jones, volumes 1 through 4 of the history of philosophy. Those kids would be ready for it by then. And we get to Aristotle, we do a whole section on logic. These kids have been thinking logically all their lives. They've been showing what it means to think rationally in their education all their lives, and now they get it formally and explicitly in a logic section, the history of philosophy. Because what an education! These kids will come out of high school; they don't need to go to college, if they choose not to. What an education, these kids could get with the proper principles, and the proper kind of teaching. This is what education could be, and well, that's
and just to quickly go back to what you said about Mortimer Adler, the Great Books program. I think it's very important to recognize that this is not that kind of a program isn't and should not be restricted to students at elite colleges.
Right.
It's very easy to think of these works as something that you can put in an ivory tower ghetto. You can keep them there only for the elites. And the truth is, and generations past have shown us, and the work of Marva Collins and Jaime Escalante has shown us, that these great works can and should be taught at much earlier ages than restricted to grad school programs at colleges.
Yeah, and that's not just to rich kids or white kids or whatever, but to everybody. All
right, it should be a standard curriculum. And I'll also note that in the movie and in real life, education authorities were so dumbfounded by the success of Jaime Escalante teaching, kids in poverty, how calculus works. They were so dumbfounded by that they thought they were cheating.
Right.
That
That's
such was their
They made them take
notions
the
of-
AP test a second time.
Right. And they passed, of course,
Yeah.
with flying colors. But the success of Marva Collins and Jaime Escalante shows that this the kind of education program that we should all aspire to isn't limited to elite classes.
An example, and just if you wanted something a little more contextual too, in 2022 that we are in now, is in England. There's a school called the Michaela School with Catherine Bernstein, and she is going back to a more stricter focus on the individual, focus on merit, making kids understand that it's hard work that's going to pay off, not this sort of postmodern view of education. And so there are little pockets, and we do see this also a lot in homeschool. So I always like to kind of bring in the positive because I'm the Pollyanna, but there are pockets that are still out there. And so I think if parents are really interested, they can vet their schools. They can look at different alternatives, because there's still ways to get a really good education for your kids. It just may not be the easy way, which is to just send them to public school. It's not going to be that.
And Dr. D, Forbes magazine recently did a story on the micro schools and how there's a growing phenomenon of teachers who are disgruntled because they're not allowed to teach in the repressive public school environment, opting out of the system, and a few parents, who like the teacher, and also disgruntled with the public schools, send their kids to this small school in somebody's basement or whatever, which is how Marva Collins started. And you have a small school with one teacher who values systematic phonics as the means to teach reading, values the academic program, and the kids I'm sure will do much better there with that kind of program. And of course, in a setting of few students rather than 30 in a class, where the teacher can give much more individualized attention. So the micro school phenomenon of it's really very positive, of teachers who were just dissatisfied the way Marva Collins was with the public school system, and who are opting out and starting small schools. And we know how many parents are dissatisfied with the public school system. And I don't think they're gonna have any trouble finding as many students as they need to make their ends meet. But yeah, it's all about teaching method and with the teaching methods, the content, as we've been discussing. And Marva Collins showed us, not everybody's going to be like Marva Collins. She had the personality for it, but she loved those kids. Tough love, tender love is a combination of both. In the schools today, you couldn't even do what she'd hug the kids and everything you can. But in a small micro school, the parents might be okay with that, and then you could give the kids a lot of affection, the way she did. Combine that kind of affection with very demanding, very high academic expectations. It was like perfect way to go to school.
Well, this war on academic subjects is going to continue, and it's going to get worse before it gets better, at least in the public realm. But hopefully we provided some answers, some countermeasures for it. And I hope we get to leave that with our viewers today. So thanks again, panel of experts, Dr. Deanna and Dr. Andy, for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me here. You're the grand poobah, Mr. Joel Marquez, so thanks for having me on, and always great to talk to you, Deanna and Joel. So see you again next time on the Rational Educator, right?
Yep, thank you.